Alrighty, we are recording.
Excellent. You want to take the lead on this?
Sure.
I'm,
Okay.
I'm, I'm usually rambling at the beginning, so.
Yeah. Um, all right. So we went over the U.S. Constitution and the articles, and now we're going over some different of cases, court cases, Supreme Court cases, and we are now coming to the Dred Scott versus Sandford case, and we have three documents that are kind of surrounding the same issue of the Constitution and slavery.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, I'm not. Again, we've kind of mentioned this before. We're not historians, so I don't know the full
Mm,
context of this. Um,
sure.
but yeah, we are going to be talking about the different details that go into this and how the different interpretations of the original words of um, the U.S. Constitution kind of are varied between different people's viewpoints.
Yes, exactly. Especially that last point with the Frederick Douglass piece,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought was highly illuminating. I thought it was very interesting because
Mm-hmm.
when we first approached the Constitution, you and I, we came across the whole three-fifths bit, um, and maybe even some other things. Our sense was, well, all right, we're already starting to see a bit of racism
Mm-hmm.
and sort of white privilege here. But it's interesting how Frederick Douglass argues against that like forcefully. It was really I didn't know where he was going to go, and as I was reading, I was like, oh my goodness, he's like making this very interesting argument for like they could have been racist, sure, they could have been slave owners, sure, but not that document. You know,
Mm-hmm.
sort of an interesting separation between the drafters and the, as he calls it, the instrument.
True.
So Dred Scott, we've got a slave in Missouri
Mm-hmm.
um, from 1833 to 1843. He resided in Illinois, which was a free state.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then after, right, after returning to Missouri, he files suit in a Missouri court, so a lower court, for his freedom, claiming that his residence in a free territory, going back to that, that would have been Illinois, um, made him free, made him a free man. He loses this suit in a lower court,
Mm-hmm.
and then he brings a new suit to the federal court, which brings us to the Supreme Court in this case. Um, and in it, well, in the case anyway, Scott's master maintains that no quote unquote Negro or descendant of slaves could be a citizen in uh, in the sense of the language of citizenship from Article 3 of the Constitution, which grants a number of rights. So basically, what it sounds like is because I was residing in a free state, that residence, as it were, changes my status from slave to free.
Right. I mean,
And yeah, go on.
because he's like subject to the laws of that state,
Right,
which is kind of an
right.
interesting thing.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, I think that looked at from like a individual perspective or a personal perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that if you and I were in that situation, you bet we would be looking for any type of possible loophole to get
Mm-hmm.
out of that state of bondage. So looking at it from looking at it from yeah, Dred Scott's perspective, I could I mean I would entirely try to make that move, right?
Mm-hmm.
Looked at from a property perspective, that becomes really tricky.
Yeah.
I mean, one, it's not property as we like my car is property, right? I can drive my car from one state to another state and it's still my car. I own it,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the problem, I think that the separate issue is the fact that there are free states creates creates this opening, right? In other words,
Mm-hmm.
why would there be free states? It's not as if there is like, I don't know how to put this, but I don't know. I won't even try that analogy with the car. But the the fact that there are free states, I think, opens the door for this type of argument. right? So that my car going between states is not analogous fully to moving a human piece of
Hmm.
property from one state to another. So I can sort of see the um, the fact that there are free states means that those states don't want slavery, which
Right.
means that they think it's immoral. So it's more than just moving a piece of property from one place to another. You're moving it from one place to a place that says we abhor this practice.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah, there's
um,
actually similarities uh, to like carrying drugs or fireworks between states.
actually,
Um,
that might be a better analogy, right?
yeah, which is actually property, but there are different laws residing around like
Sure.
can you own it or can you purchase it? And
Yeah.
then there's like the difference like in Maryland people go up to Pennsylvania to buy fireworks because it's legal to
Right.
buy them there, but and legal to own them here, but not to buy them
Hmm.
here.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
yeah, there's kind of those edge cases or loopholes that you can find
Hmm.
in the law.
So then we get to so that there's sort of the basics of it, right?
Hmm.
What's the status, and then we get to um, uh, yeah, the actual case, um, and we get a 7-2 decision for Sandford and not for Dred Scott. Um, I mean, we can get into some of the details, but here are some things that I highlighted. The majority held that, quote, a Negro whose ancestors were imported into the United States and sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore did not have standing to sue in federal court.
Hmm.
So, yeah, anyone that, is a citizen can, sue. Um, but sorry, the larger argument basically becomes like who's in the circle and who's not, or what's in the circle and what is not
Right.
of citizenship, right? Because this raises questions not only about citizenship but also like about personhood,
Hmm.
right? Um, and essentially, the with the so I'm sorry, um, yeah, did not have standing to sue in federal court, and part of that is, oh yeah, I'm sorry, and because the court lacked jurisdiction in the case, Taney, who was the Chief Justice, dismisses it on procedural grounds. Um, so essentially, the Supreme Court shows deference to the Missouri courts where the original case was filed.
Right. Yeah, I think right at the
um,
end of the case, I think yeah, this document it ends with so in this case as Scott was a slave when taken into the state of Illinois by his owner and was there held as such and brought back into that character, his status as free or slave depended on the laws of Missouri and not of Illinois.
right. Hmm. Hmm. So, um, yeah. So I guess what you've got going on here is you've got and we were talking about this like when we first discussed the Constitution, and then sort of interpreting it, and uh, and then whatever Marbury versus Madison, our last session.
Hmm.
But you've got the Constitution at play. You've got a a practice of slavery at play.
Hmm.
You have um, the differences in how states are orienting themselves to the legality of slavery. Um, and then you've got sort of a lower court decision, and then and then finally this, the Supreme Court decision. So you've got like all of those pieces at some level are at work in this case.
Right.
Um, I think it's interesting too that this is sort of, from what I understand, the first Supreme Court case that deals with slavery.
Hmm.
There had to be one, there had to be one to sort of like tip things off. Um, and um, yeah, whatever, get the conversation started in order for abolition ultimately to prevail.
Hmm.
But what did you think about some of the specifics of the majority opinion that we read about in the case?
Right. Um, well, I guess I thought it was interesting that they resided primarily to like the legality based off of the state's definitions.
Yeah.
Um, like I think at the beginning they briefly talked about what it is true every person and every class and description of persons who were at the time of the adoption of the Constitution recognized as citizens in the several states became also
Hmm.
citizens of this new political body. Um, so like they kind of address the "we the people" clause there, but it doesn't
Yeah.
seem like they
Hmm.
really address it too much more in the court case itself. And the other
Yeah.
documents that we're going to talk about do.
Yeah.
So they're really going like from a logical perspective of what is like
It,
transferring between states and the laws
sure.
that are currently
Sure.
holding on them.
And also too, it is interesting. Like, I mean, obviously you can start an argument from a lot of different points of
Hmm.
departure. And the point of departure that Chief Justice Taney chooses is citizenship, right? I mean,
Right.
as you just read.
Hmm.
So it's like, who was a citizen at the time of the adoption, right,
Yeah.
of the Constitution? Because that's going to then play into what citizen means in the Constitution.
Right.
It reiterates that on the top of our page 27, first line, right hand column.
Hmm.
It becomes necessary, therefore, to determine who were citizens of the several states when the Constitution was adopted. What's interesting is that um, later we find out, I believe, with both Lincoln and the Douglas case or Douglas document, that and this sort of creates some tension here with Taney's argument that um, what kind of entity is a black person at the time that it was adopted, because in some states they were able to vote for the adoption of the Constitution.
Right. Hmm.
So, and by the way, that one's a little bit like I sort of get that, but I'm missing a detail or two because I'm not really. I thought that the I didn't think it was like the Constitution wasn't adopted on a national vote; that it was adopted on the representative vote.
Mm. Yeah. I don't.
But here's the key thing: if it was the case that in the free states, black people were able to vote for their representative that then voted for the adoption, I
Hmm.
can get the logic, you know.
True.
But that already creates a problem, right? In other words, if they had a vote, what doesn't the ability to vote say something about their status as a political entity, as a, I mean, I want to say citizen, but
Right. Yeah. And I mean that does get tricky, but it makes so they're asking at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, right? So though I'm assuming, I could be wrong, that those people who were able to vote remained citizens and weren't turned into slaves thereafter.
mm-hmm,
Rather,
mm-hmm,
slaves were brought in um, after the adoption of the Constitution, and they were still considered slaves. It wasn't like they switched from being able to do things and then not. But I could be
right,
wrong.
right. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess,
Right,
yeah,
like the free
the
states
question,
had different, like each state had different positions on these topics. So, which is kind of core, the core of the problem, or the thing that exposed it, is when those became
yeah,
more and more stark.
right. No, I agree. I agree. Um, it was interesting. I mean, not to jump ahead to the Douglas document, but obviously the Douglas one makes you think about slavery in the Constitution,
Hmm.
right? um, and the I do think it's interesting that while I mean, whatever, slavery and slave owners and slave owner interest was obviously a massive part of the founding fathers, maybe not all of them, but
Hmm.
and part of the industry and economy as well. I it's a stroke of genius that there is no overt mention of it in the Constitution. I mean, even Douglas interprets the three-fifth principle as not about specifically slaves,
Hmm.
but he refers to like anyone that I forget I have to look at the terminology later, but anyone that sort of is not an American, is not properly an American, or if you will, a citizen. And
Right.
he gives a spin on it that, well, that ultimately could be like um, that could be a foreigner, that could be an alien of some sort in the country, um, not just sort of shooting to pointing to the race of black folk. So it seems like a real stroke of genius, and that it's not included or that there isn't a lot, you know.
Hmm.
Almost as if sort of like the founders wanted to make this document as sort of general as
Hmm.
possible so it could be used for future generations, and these issues of whatever various political practices or economic practices or um, are then sort of open to debate, you
Yeah,
know.
I mean, they wanted to make some a universal constitution, and they cared about the division of power among the states over
Hmm.
the constitution. So they probably
Hmm.
deemed that issue as not pertinent to uh, that 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 layer of government, right? Like
Hmm.
the Constitution is very structural about like the basic human rights and then kind of the structure of how the government's going to work. So
Yeah,
I guess that wasn't really on that radar.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting too with Tanny's argument, same page, but two paragraphs down. It says they had, and he's talking about black people. They had for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. Um, just skipping ahead a little bit, they had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit, which I thought was interesting.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise. A lot of this language here is unbelievable. In
Yeah.
part, that we could use it, toward or about a human being. But what's interesting is that he's making the case that, I mean, he's still talking. This is early in the argument, but he's still talking about the Constitution, right? I'm
Hmm.
sorry, actually, no. In this point, sorry.
In
In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, the language used in the Declaration of Independence. Um, yeah, well, it's a little bit combined, Declaration of Independence and then Constitution. But he's sort of saying these practices were already in place. And it's interesting too. He's like it was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as in politics, right?
hmm.
So this is already something that's like so deeply ingrained in this generation. What is interesting too is that what Douglas does in his argument is that he actually brackets off mostly everything that's outside of the document,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So
Like
the histories of the time, intentions, right?
hmm.
But Tanny's not, right?
No, yeah,
Tanny's looking, yeah.
they're approaching it very differently. Like um so Tanny is taking the context and the history and
Hmm.
propagating it forward to the current situation,
Hmm.
whereas Douglas is taking the the words and the intent behind the document and continuing that.
Yeah. And it's tricky too because there's a question about whether or not Douglas is even looking at the intent
Hmm.
versus
Okay. Well.
just bracketing off the strict just literally I'm looking at the text, you know. I mean, he even talks about the one example where, and I didn't know this until I read his document, that it was I didn't realize the drafting and the ratification and all that of the Constitution was a closed door affair.
Right. Yep.
Remember, he brings that up. Apparently, they wanted closed doors, so nothing was leaking. They didn't hear about all of the different debates. And his approach seems to be a very closed door approach to the Constitution. I don't care. I mean, that's not true. I mean, maybe he does care about what was happening during the times, but in terms of making his point about what the Constitution says, I don't care about what was going on at the times and whether or not there were slave owners that wrote it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Oh, you just cut out. Mm-hmm.
hello,
Yep. You're back.
sorry,
It's okay.
sorry. Uh, I don't know what you got there, but basically, I was saying the bracketing versus the non-bracketing,
Mm-hmm.
and looking at all these other contextual things can lead to a different conclusion, and I find that fascinating
Right. Well, I
because
mean,
it raises. Go.
it's like the I don't remember how many different ways it was of analyzing a document,
Sure.
but I think what it was
Yeah.
like eight or something, that eight different
Mhm.
approaches that you can take, and there's overlap between them.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
how much diversity there is in the outcomes of those
Precisely, and then
arguments.
and there's no meta
Yeah,
piece that's going to say which direction you take.
sure. Mm-hmm.
Unless the meta piece is ultimately hashed out over time, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Something like that, where it's sort of like, well, now we're in a state where whatever precedent, you know, um, it dominates more than not.
Right, and especially when you just have like the social institutions and the norms of society perpetuating these behaviors and these, I mean, these normalities at that point in time, it's hard to just change that that behavior.
Right.
Especially when it's like benefiting some people extremely, they're not going to want to give that up,
Hmm.
despite the fact that it's not benefiting others and in fact
Yeah. Oh
detrimental
my
to them.
gosh. Totally. Totally.
Um, but they're
Like a
definitely,
vested interest.
yeah, definitely a vested interest, especially in the people who have power, which is
Hmm.
unfortunate. And yeah, it takes a lot to change that.
Hmm.
And whether or not you can come at that from a completely like logical perspective with the documents and the laws that you have, or from like a scientific perspective in like differences in humanity, and biology, it's like
Yeah.
which way are you going to go and what's going to decide what.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. I think the other, I mean, it's interesting too. Just looking through some of Tanny's stuff on page 29, we've got him like utilizing this language of the plain words of the Constitution itself,
Mm-hmm.
and Frederick is going to argue the same thing. Um, that I am reading the plain words of the Constitution and arriving at the argument that it's not pro-slavery. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
um, Yeah, I mean, this is bold. Look at this. Bottom of 31, last paragraph. Now, as we have already said in an earlier part of this opinion, upon a different point, the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution.
Hmm.
I mean, so that's like, and that's that, that's I don't know if it's distinctly and expressly affirmed. I even felt like the three-fifths clause was like a indirect,
Right.
um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sense of approval. You um, so yeah, we've got that there in terms of you know the basic argument. Now, I will say this: in my research, there was a dissent, as there normally is, so it was 7-2,
Mm-hmm.
and the dissenting justices had actually criticized Haney um, on a couple of points. Basically, let's see. Oh, the there's one element which basically was that Taney was saying we basically don't have jurisdiction over this, um,
Mm-hmm.
and then which basically means like then you can dismiss it on procedural grounds. But then he goes on to give substantial arguments, so arguments on the substance of the case, and uh, yeah, sorry, Justice Curtis, who was part of the dissenting opinion, found that to be somewhat curious. If you're going to just dismiss it on procedural grounds, dismiss it on procedural grounds. You don't need to go into the substance of it. And
Mm.
in it, he also argues that in the dissent that men of African descent could be citizens because they already had the right to vote in 5 states.
Right.
So it goes back to that earlier thing that we were discussing. Um, so and I'm sorry, the jurisdiction one is yeah, yeah. No, I'll hold that. What did you make of the Lincoln response?
Mm-hmm. Let me see.
So this is Lincoln. Sorry, the title is "The Declaration of Independence Includes All Men." It's a speech on the Scott decision from 1857. He does bring up, um, yeah, he has a essentially he makes some statements, then he gets into a debate with another judge that I believe is running for the same position he's running for. So this is sort of like on that campaign trail kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. Right. Um. Oh, right. Okay, that one's shorter than I thought.
Yeah, go.
Was this the one that made the argument about, or was this the other one? I'm trying to remember which one had the argument about like whether or not we the people considered like of British descent or colonization or whatever.
That was
That
uh,
was Douglas.
yeah.
Okay.
This point, he's criticizing. He opens by criticizing Chief Justice Taney of the Dred Scott decision, um, and basically argues that black people were in fact part of what was meant by sort of we the people or citizens. He does utilize, you can see this in the second paragraph, the same argument about the free Negroes were voters, right, in those states.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
um, so included in the body of the quote unquote people of the United States. Um, so also Lincoln is looking at the fact that if you can vote, I think that voting one's interesting because it's basically like if you were a inanimate piece of property, you obviously can't vote, right? My car
Right.
can't vote. So the fact that you can vote and the vote has political consequence sounds like that's what people do. That's what humans do. That's what citizens do.
Well, it is.
So
I
I
mean,
think that
isn't that part of the definition? Like, a voter is a citizen, right?
are you there?
Oh, yeah, I'm here. You disappeared for a
Sorry,
second.
whenever an alarm goes off, and I need to make sure my alarms aren't set for this hour, that's when for some reason it cuts the call.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so he's playing that element up. Um, Actually, most of that first page is about that, right? Um, and then he, um, oh, and then he turns to like how basically like things have gotten, what was it? Sort of like things have gotten better. Um, right?
Oh, you were muted for a second. I can hear you. Wait, maybe not.
Some tech problems here from my end. I apologize.
It's okay. You're
So
back.
he goes like on page 5. He talks about sort of like um, I think he's referring to an idea that things have actually improved for Black people since the founding. He does a reversal in that. He has this phrase in those days, but now, repeated throughout. An example: in those days, by common consent, the spread of Black men's bondage to new countries was prohibited, but now Congress decides that it could not, if it would. So, and he gives other examples as well, that things have actually gotten worse. So he's
Mm-hmm.
sort of addressing this other sort of piece. I did think what was interesting, the one line in the middle of that big paragraph: Mammon is after him, ambition follows, and philosophy follows, and the theology of the day is fast joining the cry. Meaning, in other words, like all of these different sort of areas of study, or culture are sort of jumping on the bandwagon of trying to reduce the status of Black folk.
Mm.
I remember teaching race, class, and gender years ago now, and I remember actually like reading sort of like the science from those times, sort of like the science that was backing up the idea that Black people are inferior on a number of fronts, and sort of like the research that they did. Like one was on using skulls, like comparing white skulls with black skulls, and how
Mm-hmm.
many seeds you could fit into the white skulls versus the black skulls, and you can imagine you couldn't fit as many into the black skull. I mean, this kind of stuff, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and and also we did some reading from like theologians of the time that basically justified it with theology, bad theology, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with some of those points.
Yeah. And something I'll mention, we were just actually talking about a similar topic in my sociology class, and um, basically, the research shows from a genetic standpoint that there's just as much diversity in the genes of people between races as there are within races. Um,
Wow.
yeah, which is kind of a crazy thought. Now, they might not be the same kinds of diversity, but there's just as much.
Yeah.
So, and I think they said there is like an 85% commonality between, people of all races,
Mm-hmm.
which,
Mm-hmm.
from a scientific perspective is very convincing.
Yeah. No doubt.
Not to mention that people have a hard time defining what race is, and that might be
Oh my
harder
God.
to do nowadays than it was then. Now that we have more diversity and more uh, interracial, mingling and families,
Yeah.
but the concept of race and like where those lines are divided is really hard to draw, and it is different for someone who lives in different parts of the globe.
Mm-hmm.
Like the
Mm-hmm.
way that we perceive others is very different, and it's just like it's a huge range. Like you if you walk there's an example. It's like if you look at people in one part of the globe and then you teleport to another part and look at them, you're going to notice like a stark contrast,
Yeah.
um likely, just because of how people migrate and live.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to walk that distance, you're going to notice like a gradual change in the
Interesting.
qualities of people. But
That's interesting.
yeah, definitely. And that's again approaching it from more of a scientific standpoint than like a legal and the social structures that were already existing,
Yeah.
which I mean I feel like should be the way that you go about it because that's going to be where you find the most evidence.
Yeah. No, agreed. Agreed. Um, yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, there's an element of like, where, like obviously Lincoln is having this debate with Douglas, but you've got the Chief Justice Taney as well,
Hmm.
and other people that just, and whatever, let's say the majority of people at the time that just weren't seeing things as we see them now,
Hmm.
as it relates to race. Um, it's my thinking goes like, what were they thinking, right?
Sure.
Like what was fueling their conclusions about race. And I mean, obviously, with Tanny, you can say there's some constitutional elements in terms of how he was reading the Constitution, so on and so forth. But then, obviously, there's the economic piece that's huge. I mean, that's free labor. It's free. Who wouldn't want free labor,
Hmm.
right? I mean, essentially free. Yeah, there's room and board, right?
Right.
Um, uh, but and then just, I mean, or really was it the case that people actually thought that this race was in some sense inferior on some wacky scale of superiority to inferiority?
Yeah,
You
and I
know?
mean that's part of the social structure aspect of it. If you're growing up and you're seeing black slaves, and then your brain is going
Mm-hmm.
to be creating those
Yeah,
associations, and that's really hard to break free from.
yeah,
When it's all that you've known when you're growing up. It's
yeah,
like it's a huge paradigm shift for young people to combat with.
yeah. Totally agreed. So then we have this debate with, at least in the, well, debate with Judge Douglas, or Stephen Douglas, I should say.
Was it a
Um,
speech or no, just a document? Oh
maybe.
yeah, it was a speech delivered by Glasgow. Um, in Glasgow. Yeah.
Um, so so when he gets to the Douglas section, it goes back to this notion of who's in the circle.
Hmm.
Um, and Lincoln, at the bottom of five, says, I mean, it's or yeah, he says he finds the Republicans insisting that the Declaration of Independence includes all men, black as well as white, and forthwith he boldly denies that it includes Negroes at all. Um, uh, so we get a little bit about sort of the political parties at the time. Um, and see, he does make this statement too at the bottom of five, where he says, "In some respects, she, so let's say a black woman, or yeah, a slave, or black woman, um, she certainly is not my equal, but in her natural right to eat the bread she earns with her own hands without asking leave of anyone else, she is my equal, and the equal of all others." And I think he gets into what he means by equal a little bit later, where he talks about sort of like traits.
Yeah.
Like whatever, not everyone's the same. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He says it on the top, or roughly at the top of six. We're not equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, social capacity.
Hmm.
Um, so, which is true. Well, I want to be careful with moral capacity, but
Yeah.
it's true that, whatever. We're not all equal in color, size, and intellect. Let's say,
Hmm.
or even social capacity. Um, Regardless of the race, we're not the same. We're not identical. But when we narrow it down to this question of a right, then then we're all the same, as it were. And this sort of goes to show too the importance of the notion of natural right that we've read in other documents. This is a long-standing notion that is playing out now in the 1800s. After uh, uh, yeah, well after Thomas Hobbes and John Locke.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so trying to see what other pieces are here. I mean, I know the big one toward the end, which I thought was really interesting because it showed that Lincoln was even sort of a man of his times.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the whole idea. I mean, essentially, he was saying, like, um,
Oh wait, here, hold on a second.
yeah,
This is on 6 near the
yeah,
bottom. This is what I was thinking of. So he says,
oh,
now let us hear. Oh, he's talking about Douglas's view. Now let us hear Judge Douglas's view of the same subject as I find it in the printed report of his late speech. Here it is. No man can vindicate the character, motives, and conduct of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, except upon the hypothesis that they referred to the white race alone and not to the African, when they declared all men to have been created equal. That they were
right,
speaking of British subjects on this continent being equal to British subjects born and residing in Great Britain. Um, in which case he kind of he says, my good friends, read
yeah.
that carefully over in some leisure hour and ponder well upon it. And then he breaks it down a little bit on page 8 or 7, which I think this is what I was thinking of.
Actually, I think it's bottom of 6 into 8
Oh yeah, or
because he's
7 into
like,
8,
he's like,
or
this is how
6
it
into
would
7.
essentially play out, right? So not only Negroes but white people outside of Great
Oh yep,
Britain and American are not spoken of in that instrument. So the English, the Scot, the Irish, and the Scot, along with white Americans,
yep.
were included to be sure, but the French, Germans, and other white people of the world are all gone to pot, according to the judge's inferior races.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the piece?
Yes, I feel like there was at a point where he said something. He was attacking this in that like you have to reread the Constitution with this kind of wording. I'm trying to find where it says that. Um. Oh yeah. So in on 7, third paragraph down. Suppose after you read it once in the old-fashioned way, you read it once more with
Mm-hmm.
Judge Douglas's version. It will thus run: We hold these truths to be self-evident that all British subjects who are on this continent 81 years ago were created equal to all British subjects born and then raised in Great Britain. And that's a very different reading from
Yes.
like
Yes.
what it currently or what
No,
it
you're
said then and
absolutely
now.
right. I mean, in other words, like if we're gonna, if we're gonna play that out, then yeah, let's see how it would be reworded one, and then also you are narrowing the scope far more than you actually realize
Mm-hmm.
in that.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, it's funny, like from a pragmatic perspective. So even like, in other words, it's or like who is it? Um, Occam's razor, right? Sort of like the simplest explanation might be the better,
Mm-hmm.
um, or the one that doesn't lead to multiple complexities that can't be answered. There's a little bit of that here, but also like a pragmatic spin would be like, you know what? You're creating far more problems in the narrow reading of all men are created equal.
Yep.
A pragmatic approach could be like, just get it's all men, it's all humans.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what they look like, what the color of their skin is. If they are human, they're in the circle. Else it leads to seeming absurdities.
Yeah, and it's like, do you val it? We are talking about these different approaches to argumentation, and it's like, what do you value in your
Yeah,
argument? So if you're
yeah,
valuing that original context, then maybe your document needs to be updated to
yeah,
explicitly state what you think it means.
yeah,
And if you're valuing the words of the document, then you should state that you value those words and not the context.
yeah,
And I mean, words are more, I guess, permanent
yeah,
in this case, and and they're also more true.
yeah. No, I agree. I mean, when you do something like, I mean, you can play with the whole men thing, but when
Hmm.
you say that all men are created equal, um, I mean, to go back to the genius of the founders, even if it were the case that some of them that were there during the debates did not agree with that statement, let's assume there were a few.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter. This is the one that made it into the document. It's a universal statement.
Yeah.
It seems like it should be applied universally.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, yeah, when you don't do it that way, then it leads to these absurdities. And I think Frederick Douglass has another version of it too, in his
Yeah.
critique. The close of this one is really interesting because essentially Lincoln, and this is when I said earlier that Lincoln's still a man of his times, as we are all
Hmm.
men of our own times. That he really is for freedom, but he's for separation.
Sure.
Um, and you see that in the I mean he's like essentially I want them to be free. I want them to have
Oh yeah.
their rights ensured. And this is this whole mulatto
Hmm.
argument that develops, which also was sort of an interesting spin because most of the mulattoes were apparently coming out of the slave states and not the free states. So, in other words, by holding on to slavery, this whole idea of amalgamation, as he calls it,
Right.
is just perpetuated, which
Hmm.
also is an interesting flip of of the argument. But no, I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's interesting to sort of see him say, as he does on 8, middle of, I have said that the separation of races is the only perfect preventative of amalgamation.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I appreciate it, in the sense that as much as Lincoln is revered and as we revere other people, nonetheless, we're human, we're flawed.
Hmm.
So it balances my view of Lincoln a bit. Meaning, in other words, like um, you can have somewhat of a questionable view on amalgamation. Uh, well, I'm going to sort of excuse it because he was,
It's progressive at the time.
yes, progressive at the time, and it's also he he was humane in the
Yeah.
sense of trying to abrogate uh, the institution of slavery. So
and
I.
and to a degree, it's at least fair,
Yeah,
right? But if you're concerning races as the individual unit, it's like in this sense, he's not treating races differently. He's just
right.
applying a weird restriction on them.
I would add too, and this is, I mean, he does seem to state explicitly his view on amalgamation,
Hmm.
but I would say, one of the crafts of a good argument is to concede a point with a qualification,
Hmm.
and he does. I mean, he concedes the amalgamation. He agrees with them on this. Let's keep the races separate, right?
Hmm.
Which, from an argumentative sort of rhetoric perspective, is a good move to be able to say, you know what, to your opponent, I agree with you on this.
Right.
However, I disagree with you that um, maintaining slavery is going to do that.
Right. Yep.
So sort of a who knows what his intention fully was there. I mean, it seems to be explicit,
Sure.
but at the same time. All right. And of course, horribly, we've got to give short shrift. We are doing 3 documents. Maybe we should have done the Douglas document first. But we did mention a good bit about it.
Yeah, it's not
Um,
terribly
we,
long.
we do know that he was a slave, um, and somehow was able to. These are the historical bits I don't know, but somehow was able to become literate and educated enough to be able to uh, uh, make this case and
Hmm.
and write this piece. Um, yeah, I actually thought this was really well written.
Hmm.
It was clear. I like how he sort of says what the question isn't, and then he gets to what the question is. 468, about 5 lines down. Does the United States Constitution guarantee to any class or description of people in that country the right to enslave or hold as property any other class or description of people in that country? Second is the dissolution of the union between the slave and free states required by fidelity to the slaves or by the just demands of conscience.
Hmm.
So we've got sort of a question that uh, really didn't come up in the first two documents, but about sort of um, the dissolution of the union. I imagine between northern states and southern states. Um, this was a hot topic that
Hmm.
he's addressing. Um, and then he sort of gets into yeah, it's like, what is the Constitution? I love this. Like, I'm going to ask this a bold question, and then I'm going to answer it. It is a plainly written document, beginning with the preamble, filled out with articles, sections, provisions, and clauses defining the rights, powers, and duties to be secured, claimed, and exercised under its authority. It is a full and complete text in itself.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, the way he says that's very interesting.
yeah,
I will tell you, it's no vague, indefinite, floating, unsubstantial ideal something, colored
right.
according to any man's fancy. Da, 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 plainly written document, not in Hebrew or Greek, but in
Yeah,
English,
yeah,
which is a language that we all know, right? It's like,
right.
yeah.
So that on as we go through, this is where he does sort of the bracketing, as I mentioned earlier.
Oh,
For
one other thing, I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah, sure, go for it.
He explicitly mentions down here, at the bottom of this same page, uh, no court in America, no Congress, no president can add a single word thereto or take a single word therefrom, right? Like we're talking about
Mm-hmm,
the immutability of this document.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, without a vote, right?
Yeah, without vote. Yep,
Yeah, yeah, or yeah, yeah.
without the
Can only be
meanings.
altered, amended, or added to by the people.
Hmm.
Yeah, um, and in that we because that is a type of bracketing too, right? They can't add to it. Um, he
Which
says
their
again,
arguments are doing.
yeah, yeah, precisely. He says again, it should be borne in mind that the mere text, and only the text, and not any commentaries or creeds written by those who wished to give the text a meaning apart from its plain reading,
Hmm.
was adopted as the Constitution of the United States. Um, yeah, yeah. The other bit, hold on, is this slavery? I guess. Yeah, it would be the wildest absurdities and lead to endless confusion and mischiefs if, instead of looking to the written paper itself for its meaning, it were attempted to make us search it out in the secret motives and dishonest intentions of some of the men who took part in the writing of it. So he is like, I mean, it is. There are walls around this text that you just can't address.
Yep.
Um, in literature they call this the death of the author. You just deal with the text, you don't deal with the author's intention.
Hmm.
um
And I think
so
he
yeah.
brought up, I don't know if I'm seeing where this is, but I think he brought up the point that, this is the document that we're holding, and what, we're like 80 years out at this point.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
they're no longer a part of the picture. It doesn't really,
Yeah,
like, that's
he
not
does.
something that matters. Like, what matters is that we have the text,
Yeah,
and that's how we're using the text to interpret. We're interpreting that text as law, and that's how we're interpreting it. We're not interpreting it from a past viewpoint
yeah,
necessarily.
exactly. And again, back to the genius of the founders in sort of writing it in such a way. We dealt with this when we were talking about the Supreme Court. I guess this was Marbury versus Madison, or a session before, I forget.
Hmm.
But we were talking about this with the Supreme. Oh, we were, because there was we were talking about the developments of the lower courts and things like that
Hmm.
with one of the first laws that was passed by the Congress after the Constitution. That there was like, yeah, there's going to be a Supreme Court, but how many justices there are going to be, you're going to determine that. Future generations are going to determine that.
Hmm.
Sort of like, and there's a balance because you can't be so general that it's vague. you
Yeah.
and yet there's an element of not being so specific that it becomes such a rigid text, and you can't there can't be progress on social fronts such as, racism in America,
Hmm.
slavery, things like that.
Yeah, it's like
Um,
it's specific in that it creates a structure and allows for development within the structure, but it doesn't define every single, like it doesn't iterate every single law or every single aspect of humanity.
yeah, precisely. Um, on the bottom of 470, lower right, or the right hand column, he says, so he's referring to these other lecturers in this debate, as it were, who give the Constitution a pro slavery interpretation. Upon its face, it of itself conveys no such meaning. And that's when he starts to sort of like go through individually all of the articles um, that his debate partner um, brought up. Article 1, Section 9, so on and so forth.
Hmm.
Um, and then he does if you will, his version of a bracketed plain meaning interpretation of those articles.
Hmm.
I don't have a lot of time, and I
Yeah.
apologize to you and Frederick Douglass, but I thought the one thing that was really interesting was the how he did a spin on the 3/5 principle.
Hmm.
This is on 472. He was like, so lower part. He says a black man in a free state is worth just 2/5 more than a black man in a slave state. So
Mm.
yeah, free state as a basis of political power under the Constitution. Therefore, instead of encouraging slavery, the Constitution encourages freedom by giving an increase of 2/5 of political power to free over slave states,
Hmm.
which I thought was it was a brilliant way of looking at it.
Oh
Usually,
yeah.
when we look at the 3/5, we're always like, oh my gosh, it reduces this individual to, not a
Hmm.
whole person, and the focus of the argument's there. But then, you
Because
know,
there's free states, it's like the difference between the same person in one state versus the other gives them more power and
yes,
gives that state more power in the union.
and is that implicitly implying, right, that the founders were not pro-slavery, right?
Hmm.
Because you're giving more power to. I was like that is there was a part of that where it was just like it was just cool, like a
Hmm.
cool like wow, I hadn't sort of thought about it that way.
Sure.
Um, yeah, there's a lot here. Unfortunately, I've got to end soon,
Yep,
but
that's fine.
we could start with the rest of this next time.
We could. What are we going over next time though?
Are we doing Plessy versus Ferguson?
Oh, it looks like we have Brown v. Board on the
Oh, we do
list.
have Brown. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I was
That
wondering if we were
is.
doing Plessy or not, but because I saw it, that
No, I
was next
think
in the
that.
document. But
Yeah, this. Um, hold
and
on.
Brown v. Board is one of the longer ones, right? Because it has multiple appeals.
Maybe. No, it's short.
Oh,
Oh no, it's got appeals. Maybe it is a bit long. Oh yeah, that's it's not. No, it's not too long. I think it's.
are you still there? Oh, are you there? Hello?
And a alarm went off
Ah,
again.
gotcha.
So all right, well we'll stop there. Um,
Alrighty, we'll
and
figure out what we're gonna address next time.
yes,
We
no
might touch
doubt.
at the
If
beginning.
I'm correct, I actually think we're on um, uh, segregation issue. I think
Hmm.
Brown versus Board of Education actually deals with whether or not schools should be segregated.
Yeah,
So
it's on
it'll
topic.
it'll be it'll yeah, exactly,
Cool.
precisely.
Alrighty.
Awesome, man. All right, thank you.